People wanting to tweak Louisiana's tough abortion ban meet a wall of resistance at the state capitol.
2 more bills were killed today. Sabrina Wilson joins us with more.
A majority of the lawmakers on the House Committee on the Administration of Criminal Justice voted to kill a bill by a North Shore state representative and one by a New Orleans legislator. Both Representative Mary Dubuisson of Slidell and Representative Candace Newell of New Orleans say their bills aim to clear up confusion for doctors who feel paralyzed by the state's near total abortion ban. Dubuisson's bill deals with miscarriages and she says is meant to clarify that the performance of a medical procedure to treat a patient who has been diagnosed with a pregnancy that has ended or is in the process of ending due to a spontaneous miscarriage or a complication that renders the pregnancy non-viable is not an abortion. Newell's bill said abortion shall not mean the removal of an ectopic pregnancy, whether through surgery or medical treatment. The pro-life group Louisiana Right to Life opposed both bills.
I don't know of any other condition that we treat as physicians where we have to worry about some sort of legal ambiguity to do the right thing or just to have the right conversation with our patients.
As a result, women carrying dead babies will be forced to carry them to term, even at risk to their personal health.
This instrument does not provide for any exceptions. It simply clarifies, like I said, on what is not an abortion.
The actual words of this bill, if passed, would legalize abortion before viability in this situation. That's what the words read to me.
Some medical professionals who spoke in favor of the bill said fear of being prosecuted for making a medical decision is causing some doctors to question whether they want to continue to practice medicine here in Louisiana. Now, last week, a bill to add exceptions for rape and incest victims also was killed. Most of the abortion bills have been decided along party lines.